Okay, today I'm bringing you 5 must-draft wide receivers that you should be drafting in your fantasy football leagues in 2023. It's so easy to say, hey, go out and draft Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Garrett Wilson, Amon-Ra St. Brown. No doubt you go out and draft. And I want to look at these mid to late rounds, guys, that, wide receiver 25 and later, right? Trying to get your values and where you can win your drafts in those mid to late rounds. So before we get into it, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know which is a must draft wide receiver for you. And go to flockfantasy.com/land, the best way to support what Zach and I are doing here. Get our bonus content, our articles, our rankings. Submit your own rankings. Submit your own articles. Flockfantasy.com/land. Not only that, you get a 30% off at sign up. You unlock our rankings, our fantasy hotline, a personal DM with Zach and myself, and so much more. It is the best way to support what we're doing here. And the one last thing before we get into it, use our code LAND at sign up for deposits to match up to $100. So if you deposit 10, you get 10. If you deposit $100, you get 100. Once again, at Underdog, use our code LAND. And let's get straight into it. My first must-draft wide receiver that I have been raving about all off-season on our Dynasty channel, and now I'm going to be bringing him here in the redraft channel. That is Elijah Moore. On Underdog currently right now, wide receiver 48. He's currently my wide receiver 38. So I'm significantly higher than the community right now where he's getting drafted. I believe he's going to be taking a massive step going into his third year now that he is traded to the Cleveland Browns. And let me remind you, the Cleveland Browns gave up a second-round pick and also a third-round pick to acquire Elijah Moore. Elijah Moore was drafted with the first pick in the second round in the 2021 draft. There's no doubt in my mind he would have been a first-round draft pick wide receiver if it wasn't for this stacked wide receiver class in that year, right? Jamar Chase, Devonta Smith, Jalen Waddle, Kadarius Toney. I mean, the list goes on when it comes down to that class and all the wide receivers that went in the first round. But something that's really incredible now is that he's going to be playing with one of the best quarterbacks he has played with by far, right? I mean, Zach Wilson, Mike White, Joe Flacco was his quarterbacks. And obviously, we all know all those guys. I guess technically didn't pan out. Obviously, Joe Flacco had his own success later on, but Joe Flacco at the end of his career. Now, Elijah Moore pairing up with Deshaun Watson, who has had success in, producing top 5, top 15 wide receivers in the past with DeAndre Hopkins, in 2018, 2019. 2019, and in 2020 he had Will Fuller and Brandon Cooks, who were both a top 15, top 8 wide receiver finish, obviously before Will Fuller was injured. So now you step in with Deshaun Watson, a top 5 fantasy quarterback outside of his rookie year, and this past year, obviously, finally with the team for a full off season, a full season as well. All 17 games is the expectation that he's going to be playing. And Elijah Moore finally going into a team that wants to utilize him, that wants to give him as much opportunity and as much, at least, targets we hope to expect to do that. So in your Underdog leagues, redraft league, he's kind of going in the mid to late rounds here. I guess you can say 7th, 8th, 9th round, really depending. And when you really think of value, that's exactly what you want to do, especially around the people he is going around, right? And this is what I'm trying to bring, the must draft guys, these value players that you can kind of lean on and say, you can see these spike weeks for your team. Elijah Moore, once again, wide receiver 48. Here are some people going before or ahead of him. Rashad Bateman, Cortland Sutton, Jameson Williams, Juju Smith, Odell Beckham, all those guys, either not question marks at wide receiver, but more in the sense of I feel more comfortable drafting Elijah Moore and liking his value significantly better than the rest of the people. And Michael Thomas is also on that list, right? Question marks with Michael Thomas. Question marks with Rashad Bateman now with Mark Andrews, Zay Flowers, Odell Beckham is there as well. Cortland Sutton, we saw not looking like the same guy. They draft Marvin Mims, right? Jameson Williams missing the first 6 weeks of the season, right? Juju Smith now playing with Mac Jones. How much do you want to lean on that? So there's so many different scenarios trying to find those values. And compared to his wide receiver, the wide receiver one on that team, which is Amari Cooper, who is going significantly earlier than Elijah Moore. Amari Cooper, wide receiver 18, Elijah Moore, wide receiver 48. That is 30 places later that you can get the wide receiver 2 on that team with a top 5 quarterback, at least with the history of a top 5 quarterback finish, in the history of him producing top relevant wide receivers. So if you can, I am always going to be drafting Elijah Moore in those mid to late rounds. My second must draft wide receiver, great value right now as well, in my opinion, that is Christian Kirk. And he probably will be taking a step back, but he's not getting drafted nearly as high as he was last year. So currently on underdog, wide receiver 27, and he's my wide receiver 26. And this is purely just based off value and what you can get on the market and where he's also getting drafted. But let me remind you, Christian Kirk, a guy that finished a top 12 wide receiver, finished in top 15 in targets as well this past year, with Trevor Lawrence taking that next step. And now the fantasy community, whether it's redraft or dynasty, really is leaning on Calvin Ridley, where I don't believe that is the case. I don't think you should be heavily leaning on Calvin, which I'm not saying Calvin Ridley is going to be a bust or is going to be taking 100% of the workload from Christian Kirk. I think that's completely wrong. I think Christian Kirk is going to be getting a significant workload, and Calvin Ridley, excuse me, and so is Christian Kirk. But now, how much is that workload going to be? I think there's going to be a little bit more efficiency. I would say, Christian Kirk caught 84 out of 133 targets. So I think that number will potentially be a lot lower, but also a lot closer. So he will catch more receptions with probably a little bit less targets, be a little bit more efficient on the ground with maybe even more touchdowns as well. So when you really look at this offense and you're really trying to say, okay, what are they trying to do and how is Calvin really going to be affecting this person? I don't think he's going to be affecting Christian Kirk. He's going to be affecting the Zay Jones, right? The Marvin Jones who was on this team, the Jamal Agnews. He is taking all those targets away from those guys who were playing and rotating on the outside, where Christian Kirk is going to be continuing his operation, I guess you can say, in the slot receiver role. So once again, always based off value and how much you can get for some of these players. And I'm comparing Christian Kirk to the value that you can get for him on underdog right now. Wide receiver 27 on underdog, which is Christian Kirk. But Calvin Ridley, wide receiver 17. So 10 players later, or 10 wide receivers later, you can get a Christian Kirk, who I believe is still going to be a top 15, a top 20 wide receiver. And here are some players that Calvin Ridley is going around that I would be questioning, okay, do I want to go with Calvin Ridley, who hasn't played a full year right now, who also really doesn't have the chemistry with Trevor Lawrence that Christian Kirk has? Once again, not a knock on Calvin Ridley. I still believe he's going to be great. I feel a little bit more comfortable actually with Christian Kirk and the value he's going to be bringing me when I'm looking at these drafts. Okay, a couple people going before Calvin Ridley and after Calvin Ridley that I would want to potentially be leaning on a little bit more, right? DK Metcalf, wide receiver 15. Deebo Samuel, wide receiver 16. I think this is a little bit high, but still I think it's very interesting. Amari Cooper, wide receiver 18. Christian Watson, wide receiver 19. Right? And then you kind of get in these shaky areas where, okay, do you want to lean on Mike Williams, DeAndre Hopkins? I think those are a little bit shaky players. But once again, when you compare to who's going around Christian Kirk, and if I would rather lean on Christian Kirk than some of these other players, I'm still going Kirk. Once again, players before and after. Drake London, as much as I love Drake London, I believe he's going to have a breakout year. Who's this quarterback play? Desmond Ridder, a guy I'm really leaning on, but do I want that in my underdog leagues? Do I want that in my redraft leagues? Maybe, maybe not, right? Once again, not a knock on Drake London. Let me just ask you, who has the better quarterback? Ask yourself that question. So Drake London, wide receiver 25. Terry McLaurin, wide receiver 26. I'd rather have Christian Kirk over Terry. Michael Pittman at wide receiver 28. I'd rather have Christian Kirk over Michael Pittman. Christian Kirk over Chris Godwin at wide receiver 29. I'm 100% taking Christian Kirk, right? So once again, I'm looking at the players that are going around Christian Kirk and saying, okay, where will I be leaning right now, and how do I feel like I'm going to get my return on investment as well? I still believe he, once again, going to be finishing as a top 20 wide receiver. He's currently going as a wide receiver 27. So I feel really comfortable in drafting Christian Kirk. My next must draft wide receiver that I think both Zach and I are kind of raving about in a dynasty perspective and a redraft perspective, and that is Jahan Dotson. He is currently wide receiver 41 in the community on Underdog, and he is my wide receiver 37. So and honestly, he could be significantly higher. He's significantly higher in my dynasty rankings as well. But the reason why I want to bring up Jahan Dotson, where I know a lot of people are questioning, and that is the quarterback play. And we saw what happened with Jahan Dotson last year. But let me also remind you that he was going through these multiple quarterbacks, Taylor Heineke, Carson Wentz, and was still kind of producing and putting up these top numbers. And when I say top numbers, I think of top numbers as in, respectable numbers as a rookie that we weren't expecting him maybe to take in the first year, right? Coming into an offense where Terry McLaurin was on, and he was going to be demanding a lot of opportunity, especially with Carson Wentz, and how Carson Wentz was, once again, the year before targeting Michael Pittman. And we saw the connection with, okay, Carson Wentz with Michael Pittman, but now insert Terry McLaurin, and we kind of thought that same exact thing. But in reality, it was Carson Wentz and Jahan Dotson. And then when Carson Wentz got injured and he got benched, whatever the case may be, Taylor Heineke kind of geared towards Terry McLaurin, where in reality, Jahan Dotson probably was the best bet. Once again, not the wrong move for Taylor Heineke, what he's comfortable with. But with all that being said, Jahan Dotson starting off really solid in the first couple weeks, and then falling off with having an injury in the middle of the season that really hurt his upside, right? Finishing with multiple games, five to six games over double-digit points as a first-year wide receiver, where you can kind of lean on a little bit as a flex option. Now coming into his second year, once again, looking at base value and where I'm drafting maybe Terry McLaurin versus Jahan Dotson, I will be leaning on Jahan Dotson a little bit more, especially going into his second year with someone like a Sam Howell, who we saw a glimpse of success in the last game of the season, which, by the way, all the Cowboys defensive starters were playing in that game in week 18. So keep that in mind. So Jahan Dotson right now, wide receiver 41 versus Terry McLaurin, which is wide receiver 26. Once again, you look at these names and you're saying, okay, where I'm going to be drafting Terry McLaurin, and who are those people around there, and then versus Jahan Dotson. Once again, before and after Terry right here. A Keenan Allen, I think there could be an argument. A Drake London, there could be an argument. I kind of just brought my take on Christian Kirk, and then Michael Pittman. So it just really depends on how you really want to feel about Terry McLaurin there. There's some players I would take over Terry McLaurin, like Christian Kirk, right? And then you have an argument with Michael Pittman, with Anthony Richardson. All depends. But I think what's really important here is the value that you can get with Jahan Dotson, and the people and the situations that you're going to be put in when you're really looking at a next player. So once again, players before and after Jahan Dotson. Hollywood Brown with Kyler Murray maybe missing the first half of the season. We'll see what happens, right? Gabe Davis, I'd rather have Jahan Dotson. Brandon Cook, who you might see later in this video. Quentin Johnson, I got one of my favorite wide receivers in this rookie draft, but how much workload is he going to be getting? And then same thing with Zay Flowers. How much do you want to lean on a rookie with Zay Flowers and Lamar Jackson with so many question marks, especially so many mouths to feed, both with Quentin Johnson at the Chargers and Zay Flowers as a Baltimore Raven? In dynasty perspective, completely different conversation, but I would rather be leaning Jahan Dotson right here, which makes him one of my must draft wide receivers. My fourth must draft wide receiver on this list, and that is Brandon Cooks. Yep, Brandon Cooks. I think he's going really late right now in drafts with a history of success in the wide receiver position, now playing for the Dallas Cowboys. I think this is going to be an interesting pickup, and hear me out. Wide receiver 42 according to the community right now, and he is my wide receiver 40. So look, there is definitely some room for improvement here, and as we get closer and closer to the season, I can definitely see him rising. And if you're doing underdog drafts right now early in the off season, I think he's going to continue to rise, and he may not be of value. So definitely try as soon as possible to be drafting Brandon Cooks. But once again, again, wide receiver 42. But the history of success at the wide receiver position, I think it is extremely crucial and important, right? And obviously he has played with multiple quarterbacks and multiple teams and finished. But what's so consistent about Brandon Cooks is always the finishes that he has had, always finishing as a top 15, sometimes outside the top 15, probably based off of injury, but always finishing as a top 15 wide receiver no matter the quarterback play. Brandon Cooks has always had multiple quarterbacks, you know, Tom Brady, Jared Goff, Deshaun Watson, Davis Mills, and has always have successfully been a top 15, at least top 20 wide receiver finish. And he's currently, once again, going as the wide receiver 42. And there's no way I'm going to be comparing Brandon Cooks to CeeDee Lamb, because we all know how high CeeDee Lamb is going. But once again, looking at the value and where you can get him around the people that are getting drafted around him, obviously there are some people that I would rather have over Brandon Cooks, but once again, at the market value, I think it is really, really good currently right now. And you can probably see it here. Gabe Davis, wide receiver 40. I'd rather have Brandon Cooks. Jahan Dotson, which I just brought, I'd rather have Jahan. Quentin Johnston, the same situation when I was talking about Jahan Dotson. Going into his first year, how much do I want to lean on that rookie? He probably has some spike weeks, but how much do we want to lean on that? Same thing with Zay Flowers. When you look at Michael Thomas, how much do I want to lean on Michael Thomas? The same thing with Rashad Bateman. There's a conversation to be had with each and every one of these players, but Brandon Cooks stepping in to this year with, you know, Michael Gallup, we kind of taking that back step this past year, you know, Jalen Tolbert being absolutely nothing, T.Y. Hilton coming in and really trying to help, but not really being that X factor that they needed. Brandon Cooks can play the slot. Brandon Cooks can play the outside. Brandon Cooks can be a reliable red zone target as well. So going into a whole nother season, a whole nother offense here with Dak Prescott, who has once again proven to be a fantasy relevant quarterback and also produce fantasy relevant wide receivers. I'm really happy to be drafting Brandon Cooks this year. My last must draft wide receiver, that is Brandon Ayuk. He's currently wide receiver 31 on Underdog, and he's my wide receiver 28 currently right now. And one of the things I really wanted to bring here is the market value when you really compare Brandon Ayuk versus Deebo Samuel. But before we even get into that, I really want to compare their stats and really have you guys understand why I'm leaning more towards Brandon Ayuk this year versus Deebo, which I have hinted in a video, must avoid wide receivers as well. Hopefully that is either out or coming out here soon, so I don't want to talk too much into that. But one thing I really wanted to focus on is when you really compare the numbers of Deebo Samuel and Ayuk, but Brandon Ayuk is significantly better, right? And would have had the higher finish. But one thing I once again really wanted to focus on is the points per game. If you were to extrapolate Deebo Samuel's all of his points and scores and everything that he has done this past year in 2022, because he did miss 4 games, he still would have finished with less points per game than Brandon Ayuk. 13 points per game for Deebo Samuel, 13.4, very minuscule for Brandon Ayuk, but still significantly better. Not significantly, a better points per game, but at a cheaper price. And I think that's where I want to lean on. And that's my next point. What is the value that you can get right now? And where are you drafting Brandon Ayuk? Wide receiver 31 currently right now. And these are the players that he's going around that I personally would rather have Brandon Ayuk over some of these players. That's Michael Pittman, wide receiver 28. I'd rather have Brandon Ayuk, according to the situation. Chris Godwin, I'd rather have. Jackson Smith and Jigba, there can be a conversation. I think a lot of people will still lean Jackson Smith with Geno Smith there, so completely fine. Mike Evans, that Tampa Bay wide receiver room, I kind of want to avoid. Tyler Lockett is the same thing. A lot of regression people are expecting to be coming his way. So Brandon Ayuk, once again, wide receiver 31. I'm really comfortable taking him there compared to where Deebo Samuel is currently getting drafted right now, which is significantly high in my opinion. Wide receiver 16, and here are some wide receivers going before and after him. T. Higgins, wide receiver 14. Obviously, you want to go with T. DK Metcalf, wide receiver 15. Calvin Ridley, wide receiver 17. Right, I kind of brought Christian Kirk a little bit early in the video, but when you really look at Calvin Ridley or Deebo Samuel, I think I want to lean more towards Calvin Ridley potentially. Amari Cooper, I'd rather lean towards Amari Cooper over Deebo Samuel, right? Christian Watson going later than Deebo Samuel in wide receiver 19. So once again, this is not a knock on Debo. I'm not saying Debo is not going to have a decent year. I'm just looking at the market value. I can get Brandon Ayuk significantly cheaper, right? And someone that's still going to be getting the same amount of points per game, at least we hope, and going into 2023, getting the same amount of points per game than Debo Samuel, that is going at wide receiver 16 in the top 20 versus, Brandon Ayuk going as wide receiver 31. So once again, looking at the market value and really trying to understand where the values I can be getting, what are the best values I can be getting, and how I can, take advantage of that in any form of draft, whether it's on the dog or redraft with, home leagues, whatever the case may be. So once again, guys, here are my guys: Christian Kirk, Brandon Ayuk, Elijah Moore, Jahan Dotson, and Brandon Cooks. Let me know what you think. Comment down below, like, comment, and subscribe. And this is the Redraft channel. We're going to be continuing to pump out more content on the Redraft channel. And as always, it's all love.
Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, LAND, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.
It's so easy. Even your grandma could scan that QR code right there.